January 31st, 2026, Catalina Foothills, Arizona, 9:50 p.m. A garage door closes, the house goes dark, and somewhere outside, in the desert, someone is already waiting. 41 minutes, a camera disabled, a pacemaker silenced, an 84-year-old woman gone. By the end of this episode, you will know exactly what happened between 9:50 p.m. and 2:28 a.m., minute by minute, and you will understand why 41 minutes was all it took. In the last episode, you learned who Nancy Guthrie was, a woman who had lived in the same house for 50 years, a woman whose routine was so fixed that a stranger could map it in weeks, a camera at her front door that could see but could not record, a daughter worth $40 million, and a 12-hour window every Saturday night where no one would check on her. Now we go inside the night it all collapsed. The evening of January 31st started the way it always did. Nancy took an Uber to her daughter Annie's house around 5:32 p.m. The FBI would later track down the driver, interview him at length, and confirm there was nothing unusual about the ride. Just a regular pickup and drop-off, Sheriff Chris Nanos said. The driver was the last person outside the family to see Nancy that day. At Annie's house, the family had dinner. They played games. It was a Saturday night like any other, the kind of evening Nancy had built her whole life around. Her grandson was there. Her son-in-law Tommaso was there. It was ordinary in every way that matters. And that is exactly the point. Because while Nancy was sitting at her daughter's kitchen table, someone may have already been watching her house, checking the windows, noting the cameras, measuring the darkness. Around 9:45 p.m., the evening wound down. Tommaso Cioni loaded Nancy into his car and drove her home. The drive was short, about 4 miles. He pulled into her driveway. The garage door opened at 9:48 p.m. Nancy went inside. The garage door closed at 9:50 p.m. Cioni made sure she was safely in the house before he left. The sheriff confirmed this later. Cioni drove Nancy home after dinner and made sure she was safely inside before leaving. Then Cioni drove away. And for the next 4 hours, nothing happened. No calls, no messages, no motion alerts, no sound. Nancy was presumably in bed, in the house she had lived in for half a century, in the neighborhood where the worst crime anyone could remember was a stolen suitcase and a bicycle swiped from a yard. 4 hours of silence, 9:50 p.m. to 1:47 a.m. The quiet before everything changed. Think about what that silence means for the investigation. 4 hours is not a gap, it is a runway. 4 hours for someone to move into position, to park a vehicle somewhere in the winding, unlit roads of Catalina Foothills, where the mesquite trees and saguaro cactus provide cover in every direction. To wait for the house to go still. To wait for the lights to go out. To approach on foot, in the dark, through a neighborhood with no streetlights and no sidewalks, and no one looking out their windows at 2 in the morning. Tucson in late January. Nighttime temperatures drop to the mid-30s, low 40s. Cold enough to see your breath. Cold enough to make an 84-year-old woman's bones ache. And dark. Not city dark, not suburban dark, but desert dark. The kind of dark where you cannot see past your own hand. CNN's Ed Lavandera had said it himself when he visited the neighborhood. He was struck by how you simply could not see. Into that darkness, at 1:47 a.m. on February 1st, something moved. The Google Nest doorbell camera at Nancy's front door registered activity. Not a recording, because Nancy had never paid for the subscription that would have allowed that, but a disruption. The camera's connection was interrupted. Investigators would later determine that a man wearing a ski mask and gloves had approached the front porch and attempted to disable the camera. He tapped it first. When that did not work, he pulled leaves from a planter beside the door and used them to cover the lens. He knew where the camera was. He came prepared to deal with it. And that single fact, that he did not fumble, did not search, did not seem surprised by the camera's presence, told investigators something critical. This was not his first visit. The FBI would later confirm that doorbell camera images showed the same masked figure had been at Nancy's front door on at least one prior occasion, without the backpack he carried on the night of the abduction. Sources told multiple outlets that this earlier visit appeared to be a reconnaissance trip. He came to look. He saw the camera. He left. And then he came back, prepared. 25 minutes passed. At 2:12 a.m., the camera's software registered a motion event. Something had moved within the camera's detection range. This should have been the moment the entire abduction was captured. A clear video of whatever was happening on Nancy Guthrie's front porch in the middle of the night. But there was no video. The Google Nest camera had detected motion. It had flagged the event. The technology had done exactly what it was designed to do. But without the paid subscription, a few dollars a month, the camera could not save what it saw. It was like a witness who opens their eyes, sees everything, and then immediately forgets. This is the detail that will follow this case forever. A camera that was there, that was on, that detected the very moment something happened, and recorded nothing. But not quite nothing, because data, even deleted data, even data that was never meant to be saved, leaves traces. And the FBI knew this. They partnered with Google, the company that owns Nest, and went into the back-end servers. What they found would become the biggest break in the case. 4 still images, 2 short videos, one 27 seconds, the other 14 seconds. Fragments, ghosts of data that the system had processed but never formally stored. And in those fragments, investigators saw something that changed the entire direction of the investigation. An armed individual on Nancy Guthrie's porch, wearing a ski mask, wearing gloves, carrying what appeared to be a handgun in a holster. And on his back, a black 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker Pack backpack, the kind sold at Walmart for under $20. The FBI released these images on February 10th. They described the suspect as male, approximately 5'9" to 5'10", with an average build. In some images, he appeared to have dark facial hair, a mustache, visible beneath the edge of the ski mask. He moved with purpose. He did not hesitate. He knew what he was there to do. Before we continue, if you're finding this investigation valuable, hit subscribe, because what happened in the next 16 minutes, between 2:12 and 2:28 a.m., is where the case gets truly terrifying. At 2:12 a.m., the motion sensor triggered. The suspect was on the porch. The camera was already covered, and at some point in the minutes that followed, he entered the house. How he got in is one of the questions investigators have not fully answered. Associated Press and CBS News reported that there was signs of forced entry at the residence, but through which door, which window, which point of access, that has not been made public. The doorbell footage shows the suspect at the front door, but whether he entered through the front, the back, or somewhere else entirely remains unknown. What is known is what he found inside. An 84-year-old woman, alone, asleep. A woman who could not walk 50 yards on her own. A woman who relied on daily medication to keep her heart beating steadily. A woman whose pacemaker monitor sat on the nightstand beside her bed, quietly transmitting data to her iPhone via Bluetooth, which related to her doctors. That monitor had a range of roughly 10 to 30 feet. As long as Nancy was in her bedroom, the connection held. The data flowed. Her heartbeat was tracked. Everything was normal. At 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker monitor lost its Bluetooth connection. That timestamp is one of the most important pieces of evidence in this entire case. Not because of what it tells us directly, but because of what it allows us to calculate. Nancy's phone was still in the house. Police would find it later, sitting on the counter. The monitor was still on her nightstand. The Bluetooth connection between the pacemaker and the monitor had been running all night, the way it ran every night, silently tracking her heartbeat while she slept. The only thing that could sever that connection was distance. Nancy had to move beyond the Bluetooth range, roughly 10 to 30 feet, depending on walls and interference, for the signal to drop. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy Guthrie's body crossed a threshold, literally and figuratively. She passed from the range of her own medical device into whatever came next. And her doctors, her phone, her monitor, none of them could follow her. The math is worth considering. The motion sensor triggered at 2:12 a.m. The pacemaker lost connection at 2:28 a.m. That is 16 minutes. 16 minutes from the moment something moved on the porch to the moment Nancy was no longer in her own bedroom. In that window, someone entered the house, reached Nancy, subdued her, and moved her far enough from the nightstand that the Bluetooth signal dropped. 16 minutes to take an 84-year-old woman from her bed and carry her out of her own home. That is fast, disturbingly fast. It suggests someone who knew the layout, who knew where she slept, who had a plan for getting in, getting her, and getting out, and executed it without hesitation. A cardiologist who spoke to the Daily Mail raised another possibility. Pacemaker data does not just track connectivity, it tracks heart rate. If Nancy was startled awake, if she struggled, if she experienced terror, the pacemaker would have recorded a spike in her heart rate. That data exists somewhere. Investigators have not said whether they have accessed it, but if they have, it may tell us something about those final minutes inside the house. Whether Nancy fought, whether she screamed, whether she knew what was happening. What we know is this. Between 2:12 a.m. and 2:28 a.m., 16 minutes, someone entered the home of an 84-year-old woman who could not walk on her own, subdued her, and removed her from the house. Her blood was later found on the front porch. Droplets. Dr. Michael Baden, one of the most respected forensic pathologists in the country, analyzed the pattern for Fox News. The drops, he said, suggested that Nancy was bleeding from her hand or her face, and was either unable or not trying to stop the bleeding as she was moved from the house to the outside. She was carried through her own front door, past the camera she had paid for but not subscribed to, down the porch steps, into the desert night. And then she was gone. What followed is perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire timeline. Not because of what happened, but because of what did not. For the next 9 hours, no one knew. The house sat empty. The porch light stayed on. The blood dried in the cold desert air. Temperatures in the mid-30s, cold enough to make it congeal quickly on the concrete. Inside, Nancy's phone sat on the counter. Her medication sat in the cabinet. The pills she needed every single day, the ones Savannah had described as the difference between surviving and suffering. Her pacemaker monitor sat on the nightstand, still powered on, still searching for a Bluetooth connection that would never come back. Everything that Nancy Guthrie needed to stay alive was inside that house, and Nancy Guthrie was somewhere else. The desert around the house was silent. The bobcats and javelinas moved through the brush the way they always did. The saguaro cactus stood in the dark like sentinels that had seen everything and would say nothing. No neighbor heard a sound. No dog barked. No alarm went off. The 14 outdoor lights that Nancy had installed, the ones that were supposed to make her feel safe, lit empty ground. 9 hours is a lifetime in a kidnapping investigation. In 9 hours at highway speed, a vehicle can cover 500 miles in any direction. It can reach the Mexican border, just 60 miles south of Tucson, in under an hour. It can reach Phoenix in 90 minutes, Los Angeles in 6 hours, El Paso in 4. It can reach an airport, a private airfield, a rural property so isolated that no one would think to look for decades. CNN would later report what every investigator already knew. Every minute that passes between an abduction and when police are called increases the potential search area exponentially. By the time anyone realized Nancy was missing, that search area had expanded into something almost unmanageable. A circle with a 500-mile radius, covering parts of Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Mexico. The golden hours. That is what law enforcement calls the first hours after a crime. The window when evidence is freshest, when witnesses remember most clearly, when a suspect has not yet had time to cover their tracks. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, those golden hours passed in silence. While the suspect was driving, or hiding, or disposing of evidence, or making arrangements, the rest of the world slept. Nancy's family slept. The neighborhood slept. And the blood on the porch dried untouched until nearly noon. At approximately 11 a.m. on Sunday, February 1st, a member of Nancy's church called the family. Nancy had not appeared for the live stream of the Sunday service. She had never missed one. Not once. Not when she was sick. Not when the weather was bad. Not when she was tired. The church service was the one fixed point in Nancy's week that nothing could move. And on this Sunday morning, for the first time anyone could remember, she was not there. The call was not a casual check-in. It was the sound of something breaking in the routine that Nancy had maintained for decades. And it set off a chain of events that moved quickly, but not quickly enough. Family members drove to Nancy's house. They arrived around 11:56 a.m., nearly 10 hours after the pacemaker lost its signal. They went inside. The house was quiet. They searched the rooms. They called her name. The sound of their own voices was the only thing that came back. They found her phone on the counter. They found her medication in the cabinet, the medication she needed every day to stay alive, untouched since the night before. They found the pacemaker monitor on the nightstand, still powered on, still searching for a heartbeat it would not find. They did not find Nancy. At 12:03 p.m., more than 9.5 hours after the pacemaker went silent, the family called 911. Deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrived at 12:15 p.m. They walked into a house that looked, at first glance, like a home someone had simply walked out of, but the details did not fit. The phone on the counter, the medication untouched, the blood on the porch, not a pool, but drops. A trail that suggested movement, someone bleeding while being moved. The camera at the front door that had been deliberately obscured with leaves from the planter. And the woman herself, an 84-year-old who could not walk 50 yards without help, nowhere to be found. There was more. Inside the house, investigators found what the LA Times, citing anonymous law enforcement sources, described as blood. The Associated Press and CBS News reported signs of forced entry. Someone had broken in. The specifics, which door, which window, which lock was compromised, have not been made public. But the picture was clear. This was not a woman who had wandered off. This was not a woman who had left by choice. Something violent had happened inside this house, and something violent had happened on the way out. Sheriff Nanos would later describe what investigators found as very concerning and inconsistent with a voluntary disappearance. He said publicly what the evidence had already made obvious. She did not walk from there, he told reporters. She did not go willingly. I believe she was abducted. By that afternoon, the case had been reclassified from a missing person report to a criminal investigation. Search and rescue teams deployed. K-9 units, drones, helicopters, resources from U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Homicide investigators were called in from the start. The word homicide did not mean they believed Nancy was dead. It meant they believed a serious crime had occurred, and the people best trained to investigate that kind of crime needed to be in the room. But there were problems. Problems that would shadow this investigation for weeks and months. The crime scene had been processed quickly. Too quickly, some would later argue. The sheriff's department released the scene sooner than standard protocol would typically allow. What that means in practical terms is that the house was no longer sealed. Evidence that might have been collected on a second or third pass was potentially compromised. A camera mounted on the roof of the house, separate from the Nest doorbell camera at the front door, was missed entirely during the initial sweep. No one noticed it. No one retrieved it. The FBI had to return to the property days later to take it down and examine it. what those roof cameras captured, and whether the delay affected the quality of the footage remains an open question. And the FBI itself had not been brought in immediately, in a case that had the hallmarks of a kidnapping with potential ransom implications. A wealthy family, a vulnerable victim, a deliberate and premeditated abduction. Federal resources should have been deployed within hours. Instead, there was a gap that meant lost time, and in an investigation like this, lost time is lost evidence. Sheriff Nanos would later be asked about these decisions. He told reporters he had no regrets about his team or their efforts. He said he did not regret releasing the crime scene when he did. But the questions did not stop. A recall effort was launched against him. National media scrutinized every decision his office had made in those first critical hours. And the criticism landed hardest on a single, uncomfortable fact. By the time the full weight of law enforcement descended on this case, the suspect had been gone for more than 12 hours. Consider the full picture of what investigators were looking at. A timeline that covered less than 41 minutes of active crime. A camera that had detected the moment but failed to record it. A pacemaker that marked the exact minute Nancy left the range of her own bedroom. Blood on the porch that confirmed she had been injured. Signs of forced entry that confirmed someone had broken in. Images recovered from Google's servers that showed an armed, masked, prepared individual who had visited the house before. And then, nothing. No vehicle captured on any neighborhood camera. No witness who saw or heard anything. No trail. No ransom call in those first hours. Just an empty house, a cold porch, and a 10-hour head start that was growing with every minute that passed. There are questions that the night of January 31st left behind. Questions that investigators are still working to answer. How did the suspect arrive? No camera in the area captured a vehicle approaching or leaving the property. In a neighborhood with winding roads and long driveways, that is not surprising. But it means there is no footage of his transportation. No license plate, no make or model, nothing. How did he move Nancy? She weighed approximately 150 pounds. She could not walk on her own. The suspect would have had to carry her, or use some kind of assistance, from her bedroom, through the house, out the front door, down the porch, across the yard, and into a waiting vehicle. That is not something one person does easily in 16 minutes. Multiple investigators and retired law enforcement officials have raised the possibility that the suspect did not act alone. The sheriff has not ruled out accomplices. Was the internet disrupted deliberately? Neighbors reported that their Ring cameras lost connectivity during the night Nancy disappeared. The FBI has investigated whether a Wi-Fi jammer, a device that disrupts wireless signals in a targeted area, was used. If confirmed, it would represent an extraordinary level of preparation, not a crime of impulse, not a break-in gone wrong, a coordinated operation. The kind that requires equipment, planning, technical knowledge, and the confidence that comes from having done this before, or from having studied how to do it for a very long time. And there is one more question, one that has been building since the first episode, and one that sits beneath everything we have covered tonight. Was this the first time he came to her door? The FBI images say it was not. The figure without the backpack, an earlier visit, captured by the same camera that could detect but not record. The reconnaissance, the dry run, and the family's plea released weeks later, asking the public to search their memories around 3 specific dates. January 31st, the early morning hours of February 1st, and the late evening of January 11th, 21 days before the abduction. What happened on the evening of January 11th? Why does that date matter? The Guthrie family mentioned it specifically. Investigators have asked neighbors about it specifically. But neither the family nor law enforcement has explained its significance. Something happened that night. Something that may have been the first step, the first test, the moment a plan became real. The masked figure on the porch had been there before. He had looked at the camera before. He had walked away once. And then he came back, with a backpack, a holster, gloves, and a ski mask, and he did not walk away again. Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera saw him both times. It detected the motion. It flagged the event. It did everything it was supposed to do. Everything except the one thing that mattered most. A few dollars a month. That was the cost of remembering. In the next episode, we examine what the camera actually captured. The images the FBI recovered from Google's servers. The masked figure on the porch. The backpack. The holster. The moment he reaches for the lens with a gloved hand. Frame by frame, second by second. And the one detail in those images that investigators believe could identify him, if the right person sees it. We will also look at the gloves found 2 miles from Nancy's home, the DNA they carried, and why the national database came back empty. 19,000 tips have come in. A 24-person task force works the case around the clock. The reward stands at $1.2 million. And still, 52 days later, Nancy Guthrie has not been found. Not yet. But somewhere in Tucson, or somewhere far from it, someone knows who was standing on Nancy Guthrie's porch at 1:47 in the morning. Someone who recognizes the build, the posture, the way he moved through the dark. Someone who may have seen a black Ozark Trail backpack in a closet, or a ski mask in a drawer, or a pair of gloves that went missing on the last night of January. The FBI is waiting. The family is waiting. And Nancy Guthrie, wherever she is, has been waiting for 52 days. The camera saw him. It just could not remember. But maybe you can.